Okay, so we're going to continue talking about Darwin and the theory of evolution. Last time we were just getting the foundation established for what evolution is. Again, it is the change in the genetic frequency of a population over time, more importantly, over generations. And there's been different ideas presented, different perspectives. Darwin and the scientific perspective is the one that we want to focus on. So Darwin, he was sailing out there in the southern hemisphere as a ship's naturalist, did this for 5 years, and he wasn't trying to prove evolution or come up with these ideas. It kind of happened just by accident. So as he's sailing around, the voyage of the Beagle took them throughout the entire southern hemisphere. As he was part of the ship, he collected specimens. Grabbed this, sent it back to England. Grabbed specimens of that, boxed them up, shipped them back. And did this for 5 years. And the whole time, he's identifying things. He's having professionals back in England identify them. So Cuvier, he actually identified a lot of the fossils Darwin sent back. And that was the big thing, is they're finding these things and they have no explanation for them. How did this come to be? Where did this come from? It's not alive today. How did it get here on this planet? That's what's spurring all these questions in the 1800s, is as people are exploring more and more of the planet, more and more questions keep coming up, which is the nature of science. You should ask lots of questions. That's what science is all about. So one of the species that really kind of made him go, was this thing. This is a glypodont. Now, the picture doesn't do it any justice. It is about the size of a Volkswagen car. So it's not a little animal. It's not something that you'd easily miss if this thing was running around alive today. He found it in Argentina, so the western side of South America. And they looked all over that area. They talked to the locals. They worked with communities. Nobody had ever seen one of these alive. So they're extinct. They're gone. They do not exist on Earth anymore. But what they did find in the same geographical area as these fossils were these animals, armadillos. We have these in Illinois, southern Illinois. We're seeing armadillos show up. They've been in southern parts of the U.S. for decades, and Central America and South America for thousands of years. So Darwin's looking at this and going back and forth going, is it possible that this species over time evolves into that species? Is that possible? You look at the physical features, the characteristics, you're not changing a lot. I mean, you lose a spiky ball on the tail. You make them smaller. But there's not much more of a difference. Less hair on the armadillo maybe? Is that possible? So that question is sitting there. That question is hanging out there the entire time Darwin's on his journey. So he lets that question hang. So while Darwin's on the journey, though, he comes across lots of information and reads a lot. You're on a boat in the 1800s. There's a lot of downtime. There's no internet, no cell service. He spent time reading. He got a hold of a set of papers from Thomas Malthus. Now, Malthus was not a biologist. Malthus wasn't anybody in the sciences. Malthus was working with urban planning. And what Malthus did is he wrote essays on population growth. So he was looking at this for cities. What happens when your population grows and you have more babies being born and more kids are being produced and the population's growing, and then you hit a point where you don't have enough resources to support your population? Okay, because this was an issue back in the 1800s, well, for lots of human history. If population got too big and it went like this, and it overshoots the availability of food and resources, there's that intersection right there, then what happens? Well, some individuals don't survive. Some babies will starve. Some babies will get sick. Some people will die. So not all individuals will survive in the population because there's not enough resources available. This is just basic ecology. This is how nature works. When you overshoot the availability of your resources, not everybody survives. So Darwin's reading these papers. These papers are, again, coming from a non-biologist and wondering, how does this play into the idea of evolution? Is this potentially a piece of that bigger puzzle he's trying to solve? So he keeps drawing more questions, coming up with more things to ask and to test and different possibilities. He gets a hold of another piece of information from Charles Lyell. Now, Lyell was a geologist. And Lyell came up with the theory of uniformitarianism. Big word. And what it boils down to is that the geological processes on Earth are very slow. So for the Grand Canyon to form, that took a long time. You're not going to build the Grand Canyon in 6,000 years. Erosion is a very slow process, and it takes a long time to erode rocks. To erode thousands and thousands of feet of rock to form the Grand Canyon and these canyons we see here in this picture, it took time. The Earth is not 6,000 years old. It is much, much older. Now, Lyell never tried to present how old he thought the Earth was from a scientific perspective, but he's looking at it saying, there's no way that these geological features would form in 6,000 years or less. So that helped Darwin to look at the age of the Earth and say, okay, the Earth must be old. There must be time for things to change, for populations to evolve. If the Earth was 6,000 years old or younger, evolution can't happen. In the big picture, small things like bacteria could evolve in 6,000 years, but elephants, whales, oak trees, etc., they're not going to evolve in 6,000 years into what we have today. So that was always a huge hang-up for Darwin, is how old is the Earth? Well, Lyell, a geologist, not a biologist, but somebody dealing with geology, physical sciences, and earth science, provided that piece of the puzzle to say, yeah, the Earth is older. There's scientific evidence showing the Earth is older than 6,000 years. It is not going to work if it's 6,000 years or younger. So Darwin keeps looking for more information, more questions, more evidence. He goes to the Galapagos Islands, now famous because of him, and discovers there's different species on different islands. Now, the Galapagos is a chain of 13 islands. And what he started seeing was that certain species were found on certain islands, and that islands had different environments, different availability of food, different amounts of wind, different temperatures, different soil, different substrates. So you get this diversity. The tortoises we're looking at here. Short-necked tortoises were found on islands in which the plants had flowers that were growing low to the ground. And they tended to have a lot of thorns and spikes on those plants. So the tortoises could tuck their head in and just kind of push in and grab the flowers and get food. The long-necked tortoises were always found on islands that had really tall plants, and the flowers were way up high. So the tortoises could reach up high to get to those flowers. So there's this diversity of physical shapes and forms of the tortoises based upon the environment that they're living in and the environmental conditions. One of the big things that really helped establish this idea of the environment influencing particular traits are the finches of the Galapagos Islands. Now, 13 islands, 13 different species of finches. So you have 13 different islands out there, all different shapes, sizes. Now, these islands are over 100 miles away from the coast of South America. 10, 11, 12, 13 islands. So the finches on the islands are not commuting back and forth to South America every day. They're out on the islands and they're stuck on the islands. And so here's South America. And what Darwin proposed, is it possible finches somehow got out to the islands? You know, storm carried them out there. Sometimes chunks of shoreline break off during a storm. They could have had a tree on that chunk of land, and the finches got out to the islands. But then, once they got out to the islands, they started to adapt differently. And you had finch species 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, etc., adapting to each individual different island. Now, if Cuvier was correct and it was catastrophism, each island had all 13 species of finches on it. So every island had all 13. And a disaster happened on every island that wiped out 12 species of finches. So on this island up here, the disaster left behind species 1. On this island, it left behind species 2. This island, it left species 3. So you do that and look at the logic of that. Which one's more logical? Ancestral population migrates out to the island, gets moved out there somehow, and then they evolve based upon the features of the islands? Or that all 13 species were on every island at the same time, and a disaster selectively took out 12 species, and it never left 2 different islands with the same species? We probably want to lean towards the ancestral population gets blown out to the islands, and they adapt to the different environmental conditions, and they change over time. Finches reproduce very quickly, so it's not an issue of could they have enough generations in the last 100,000 years. They could have had plenty of generations to do this. Follow-up research has shown that finches change as environmental conditions change on those islands. So what happened as Darwin did all of this research? Spent all these years on the boat and then continued to spend years and years and years studying it. He came up with this idea of natural selection. This is not evolution. I want to put let me do the big red star there. Natural selection is not the same as evolution. It is a piece of the evolutionary puzzle. So physical evidence discovered by Darwin, other information from these scientists and non-scientists as well, scientific experimentation helps Darwin establish natural selection. Again, natural selection today is considered the best scientific explanation for why we have the diversity of life on Earth today. Natural selection has 4 components to it. Okay? 4 pieces of information or parts that have to be present for natural selection. Okay, first component. Variation exists within your population. These are all male lions. They're all different. Different size, different weight, different strength, different intelligence, different manes. There's variation in that population. Every population will compete. Competition exists within a population. They're competing for resources, breeding, etc. You're always going to fight your own kind for those resources. The winner of the competition gets to reproduce. That individual passes on their genetics. If they made that individual successful, most likely the children are going to be successful. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at what's the fourth component to natural selection.